Okay, so now the next step we're going to do is checkering. I think checkering is probably one of those things that practice, right? But it's nothing to be intimidated by. A good way to get started is to use Joe Belicki's Checkering, Gunstock Checkering. You can get this from Brownells or other places. This will give you the basics of working with checkering. What I'm going to do is go over some of the things that I use to get started. I chose to go with handheld checkering. These are Dinbart checkering tools. Each one of these cutters is roughly about $6, $7, something like that. And I will use, for a project, that would be the buttstock and the forearm, I'll use one on the buttstock and then one on the forearm. And when they start ripping the wood, that's when you go ahead and replace. But it's really don't want to replace them in the middle of checkering on say, for example, a section area. Say like in here, you want to try to finish that section, and if you do need to change the checkering tool, then change it before you start into the new section. The other thing you'll need, and I use quite a bit, is this 90-degree bent file. This is a medium cut. Again, I get this from Brownells, and that's the one that I use. These are roughly $25. And I will use probably just one on a project, or I might start on another one. And I work the tips very heavily. So on a particular project where I'm going to be doing a little bit of fleur-de-lis like this, where you have lots of stops and starts, these tips will get worked over pretty heavy. So I could use actually two of these on a particular project. This is just a toothbrush that you're going to, brush debris away. These are called mag eyes, and I'm using a 2x power on this. These are roughly $15–20, and then these, you can get these at Michael's or wherever. These are just probably some elementary shapes and designs to get your angles that you might be wanting to work with. And then last but not least is you will definitely need this, and essentially this is going to be used to set your master lines. It'd be a 3 and a 3.5 inch, and this is just the shape of the diamonds. These are going to be a little bit longer, obviously, than these diamonds. On the cutters, I only do 20 lines per inch. That generally works out for me very well. So with checkering, if you recall, when we started the finish, this was sanded down to get my base finish on. I just put 1 or 2 coats of just Truel on this. And then what I do is I like to draw my pattern out as to what I'm going to do. You'll notice I didn't follow exactly the other pattern, and that's one of the other things that I think I got hung up on, was I was trying to do exactly the way somebody else had done it. If you look real closely at their work, although very artfully done, you'll find as you start checkering, you'll find all the little errors that they made. So one of the things that I think I want to emphasize here with checkering is don't be so fixated. If you make a little mistake here in the checkering, don't be so fixated on it. A lot of times, and we'll talk more about that, you can cover that up just by using a V-file and go in a little bit deeper, and you can shape them out. By the time you finish all your checkering, generally speaking, it's hard to even see. You'll also notice on this particular pattern how they cut this in half. So when you start checkering, what can happen is if you have a little bit of a mistake, say for example, and I'm reluctant to use the word mistake, but let's say you've got 2 lines and they get a little bit wider and a little bit closer. When you cut your pattern in half like this, that means that you have a lot more control of preventing or mitigating that error from rolling on into some of the other checkering. So although the fleur-de-lis looks complicated, in reality, it's not that overly complicated. In some ways, when they break it up like this, it actually makes it easier for you. And so if you look at what I did, I start off with just drawing my outline. I like to know kind of what my pattern's going to be. I'll come back and I'll trace out. You'll also need a scribe. It's something else I forgot. And then I'll use these patterns once I draw it out. Kind of what I want to do is I'll use these then in that scribe to make sure I've got a consistent line as I go around. I'll use the scribe and I'll trace out my line. Is essentially what I'm trying to do. So I like to draw things out first. I can erase it, change it around however I need to, and then from there, then I'll use the scribe and this to then do my outline. Now, some people don't like to do the outline first. A lot of people do their master lines first. And then as they go along, they kind of have in mind where all this is going to run out. There's advantages to that. One advantage, of course, is your checkering never gets, you have a lot more control of your edges where your checkering pattern is going to be. In my case, when I draw this out and I cut out my outlines in advance, what that forces me to do is however the checkering falls into that area, that's how it'll be. The areas that'll be very challenging, if you will, are any curved areas. In this particular, you'll notice how this kind of curves down. Just take your time when you get into these areas. You will twist and turn or however you need to do it to get those lines in there. Just take your time. Checkering gets done when it gets done. There's not a timetable in checkering. I'll checker for a couple hours and maybe I stop and watch TV. I'll come back out. Generally speaking, it takes me roughly 8 hours to checker the buttstock. Now this one will probably take a little bit longer because I've got all the stops and starts. If you took out this and you took out this, it obviously is going to go a lot faster because your lines, you're doing these big long lines as you go across here, and so it goes faster. Conceptualize what you're doing with checkering. Let me just kind of demonstrate just a little bit what I'm going to be doing.
So what I'll do is I'll use the checkering template. I like the ratio of 3.5 to 1, if you will. And you'll use this and you'll draw one side of it. You'll then, using the left side of the template, you'll draw the other connecting line. And this is what you'd be doing on the wood. You'll apply that on the wood and you'll draw these lines just as I'm doing it here. And the measuring tape here was just a tape that I cut so that I could use it. It actually bends around a little bit with the wood. And so you connect your lines. Now then you have the ratio. Now imagine each one of these lines, one side of the cutter has a smooth end and the other side is cutting. So what I'm doing here is imagine each line that I'm drawing is a pass with your cutter. Now each time I use that cutter, I also use the V-file after I use the cutter to clean and dig out that line. And what that does for me is it pulls up the diamond or gives it more definition, if you will. And I'll go one direction, I'll turn around and go the other direction. Now for the other part of the line, the left side of the line, if you will, again, you'll go in the other direction. And once you start doing this, you're going to see your diamonds. Each pass that you make, you'll see these diamonds show up. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to circle in there so that you can zoom in and sort of see the diamond checkering that you're building. This is in effect what you're going to be doing on the wood. And it's just a matter of just going back and forth and repeating this process over and over. The V-file I use quite a bit. Again, I use the V-file to dig in deeper and to build up my diamonds and to clean out the lines. You want to keep it at a 90 degree as best you can and not swivel it.
Send this off to have somebody checker, and you can expect to spend 200, 250, 300, 400. It just depends on the pattern that you're going to be working with. All right, so what I've done is my preference is, as you can see, I did my outline. I like doing my outline. I kind of like to know what I'm going to be working with. There's pros and cons to that. You'll have your own way of doing it. You'll notice I kind of made this a stronger line through here so that when I'm finished, this blends in. Sometimes if you get these too small, it's hard to work with these tools. So I'll go through a couple lines here and I kind of show you what I'm doing. Really, it's nothing more than once you set master lines, and that's what I did here. I just set my master lines, set the line here, and then set the line here. So basically that's my master line. That line going right here, and then this line coming down here for the dimensional ratio of my star. I'll just show you what I'm doing. Come up to these edges, you're going to stop. I told you I like to use these files quite a bit. I use these quite a bit. And then when I come up into here, I'm using that tip. I'm kind of digging down in that tip to get that line there. Same thing going the other direction. If you came back in this direction, generally I do like to kind of get all these lines laid out. Because of this pattern, I'm constantly going to be watching these diamonds to make sure I keep things proportional. But then if you were coming this way, same concept. You're just going to check her up. And then as you do that, every time you do, you create all brand new little diamonds here. And then I use this file to clean this up. So you can see this process, I think it is a lot of fun. It is very enjoyable to me. But you can tell, especially when we get into these curved areas, you take your time and you're just doing, you're just doing one line at a time. You'll also notice what I did was when I had this master line here set, I went ahead and extended it using this. I went ahead and extended it down into this area and into up to this area. So I'll be checkering, and what I do then is I come along these edges, I'll stop right about here, and then I'll keep checkering here to make sure that when these lines join, I'm able to join them together. So there's lots of different techniques. It's impossible for me or anybody else really to tell you how to checker. Checkering is really just hands-on experience and working with it. And as you come into areas, you're going to adjust as you need to adjust to get your checkering. I would recommend not necessarily starting on your gun stock. I would get just a piece of walnut and get the concepts of checkering and get the feel of the checkering tool. Once you get the feel of it, you're good to go. You'll be going back and forth, and to keep digging this down, like all through this, you'll constantly, as you come along here, if you come over your line just a little bit, remember we've not finished our finish here. So you can still come back with, say, 320 grit and touch these areas up as you need to if you run over. All right, so let's talk, we've finished up this area here, and let's talk about a couple of things that are ultimately going to happen. If you'll notice, right up in here, there's some runovers right in here. And very important also is the way the light hits this. So whether you're inside, outside, the way the light hits this, you can kind of, it makes a big difference in terms of how it kind of casts a shadow when you're cutting. But it's a couple runovers, like right up in here. So what we're going to do is fix those. And you can kind of see them now that the light hits. You sort of see a couple of spots like right in here. So I'm using a 320 grit. And what you want to do is you're just going to let that sandpaper kind of run over those areas. One of the things, or pull it back. Maybe slide down a little bit or pull it back. And what you don't want to do is get into a sawing motion and dig that in deeper or run over into the checkering, which is going to flatten these checkers, which means now then you got to checker that in again. So you just want to just take your time, and you're just going to run that over those edges in one direction and not sliding it back and forth. And now then here what I'm going to do is I am going to kind of feather it just a little bit and come back and forth in there just a little bit. But you don't want to spend a lot of time there. And you'll notice now then you pretty much get rid of every little run over that you have. Some other options for runovers, things that you can do is you can take the file, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use this edge to flatten that outer edge of where I was cutting. So that line comes a little flatter there. And what that does for you then is that can also get rid of your cuts. This is probably one of the last steps you're going to do when you do this. And you're going to go the entire border here. And what you're wanting to do is really make your border pretty aggressive so that it stands out. When you apply your finish, you don't want the finish to stay in here too much, but what I'm trying to say is when you apply the finish, you want that border to be pretty pronounced. And you'll notice now then here, now that the checkering's finished, where I made this pronounced, prior to the checkering, it looked a little stronger than it was, but now that I got the checkering here, you can kind of see what I was referring to, the work that you've done in here, you want that to stand out a little bit. So in a way, what I did was I did a little bit of relief carving in there, and I used just a chisel, and I just sort of came in from the other direction here. And what I did was I just came at an angle here and kind of chipped that out into that line, a lot like when we did the inletting up here on the top. When you use your scribe to score that line, you kind of got a groove there, and then this chiseler can just kind of come in at a little bit of an angle and pull that wood away from there just a little bit, and that'll make that a little bit pronounced. So the only other tip I have for you is also when you get up in here onto these lines, one of the things you're going to find is when you're using this, sometimes it like builds a wall up right there at the edge, but not into that border. What I'll do is I'll take this, press down, and pull away from it, just like that. And you'll notice then, when you get up to these edges, especially in some of the hard to get areas, you can get your definition without having to sort of saw into it, which then ultimately then causes this tip to potentially run over. By digging in sometimes when you're coming in at this angle, I use this border because at the last step, as I said, I'll come back and I'll clean that border out and you'll get rid of a lot of the cut. So if you run over, those are a couple of things, tips that you can try. As you go through this, you'll develop your own techniques, but like I said, the main thing on checkering is practice. Jump in, get your hands on it, feel the tools. A lot of this will work out, and you'll get the hang of it. Last comment here. Earlier in the video, I was talking about the borders. You'll notice here, because I did my borders in advance, you'll notice here I have no control over how the checkering ends up, like right in there. And so that's what I was referring to. A lot of people will not do their borders. They'll actually do the checkering, and then they'll allow the border. They want their checker pattern to be finished. Well, I've tried that, and what happens is when you're doing your checkering, no matter what you do, if you want this sort of a groove here, right, I mean, there's only so much you can do to keep that checkering, to keep the dimensionality of that checkering clean. The only time I will allow the borders to be done last is if I'm doing relief carving, a fish scale or basket hatch or something like that. So I've done some relief carving. I pencil it, and then depending on how the fish scale goes, I let the fish scale help me generally stay within that pencil mark before I want my border to be. Anyway, lots of conversation. Again, just to emphasize here, a lot of this is just get your hands on it. All right, so we've completed the checkering on the left side, and what we want to do now is transfer this over to the right side. I like to have pretty much everything I've done on one side. I like to transfer that over to the other side. There's situations where I may not exactly replicate, particularly if I have a palm swell, or I might want to do something a little different on the other side, but generally speaking, I like to replicate what I've done. Now, on some of these patterns, you have some options. What I do is I fall back to what my art teacher taught me about 35 years ago, Ms. Maddox. I like to start off with reference points, and I draw a 90-degree here, and then I use this guy right here to then make reference points here with regards to positioning, and then I copy that over to where I'm at here so that I can replicate whatever I've done. Or I would have started with this, and this would have been my pattern, right, that I would have created here. So in addition to starting off and creating your pattern, this can also be used as reference points. And like I said, I'll get, say for example, reference points here, and then I'll copy it to the other side. In order to transfer this, what I use is, it's called Mylar paper. And once you've got your pattern here, then you lay this down and then you can trace this out, and then this has a sticky side to it. So that's what I've done here, is I've got my reference points, connected my lines, and again, reference points to get proportionality here. And then here's the Mylar paper, and that's the pattern that I copied from here. And I just stuck it onto here, and then I completed my lines using the tools that we talked about earlier. And these are just patterns. And I like to do this not by freehand, because ultimately what I'm going to be doing is using the scribe to follow along that edge so that I get a groove in there so that my cutter tool can go down in there. Now you could have used, for example, if you found a pattern or something on the internet, you can run this through the printer. And so for an example, if you were going to do fish scale, if you found a pattern on the internet and you wanted to then replicate that pattern over to your gun, you could put this in the printer, print it out, and now then you've got a pattern. So this is a project I did using a fish scale, and then this just adheres to the wood, and then I use from Profitable Hobbies, it's called a paragraver. Mine's air compressed, they also have electric. But then what you do is you just carve these out, and it's like a little dental tool with all these little different tips to it, and then you just carve this out. You do not have to be an incredible artist, which I am not, but you do want to have a little bit of patience in carving this out, turn on the radio, and just enjoy it. It's actually very fun. This is a piece of mesquite that I used. If you've not worked with mesquite, I encourage you to use mesquite. I think it's a lot of fun to work with. It's something different sometimes. If you've been working with walnuts, they all have a tendency to be the same. And then the other thing I love about mesquite is it has imperfections in it. So this was an area, wood had an imperfection in it, and I used mesquite, dyed it black, and filled in those holes. And I don't know if I got anything, yeah, like right in there. So I love mesquite. It has lots of imperfections in it, and it gives me a chance to kind of beautify that. If I were doing another one of these, I'd have probably used a turquoise or something like that. Just lots of great things that you can do with mesquite. You want to make sure that your mesquite is kiln dried so that it's been cured. But other than that, you have a lot of fun with this, and it's not a very expensive piece of wood. But anyway, so back to our project here. That's where we're at, and so now I'll go ahead and finish out the transfer of this pattern here, and then we'll go on to checkering, and then we'll be finished with checkering if there's any, and then we can go ahead and then finish the gun stock, and then this project will be wrapping up here.